Hey everyone, so just a shout out for our sponsor, Picture House in the Small Darkroom. They've been an incredible partner for us this season for the podcast, and we're just so grateful to have them, and not just because they're sponsoring, but because we really love those guys, and we're actually doing a lot of stuff with them that we'll announce later, things that have to do with some programs the foundation is going to launch. So it's really gone from just sponsoring the podcast to a much deeper relationship. And I think that just says a lot about their values, how supportive they are of the foundation, of the PhotoWork Foundation, and how much they want to help out. And as everyone knows, I've been over there a lot to discuss things with them, and I have artists who print with them, work on various post projects with them. And it's just, everyone loves hanging out over there. At the lab, you say lab, it sounds so sterile, but it's like this really cool space. It's on a number of floors, and in Chelsea and New York.
Yeah, they call it their studio.
Right.
And they're an incredible resource. So it's a film lab. They do scanning, printing, retouching. They sell film. And of course, they have a bookstore with live events. And they have a mini lab where you can have prints made of all different sizes.
Love the mini lab.
They are Picture House in the Small Darkroom. Their website is PHTSDR for Picture House, the Small Darkroom.com. And so is their Instagram, PHTSDR. And you can check out the Instagram or the website to see if they're having specials or what's going on at the bookstore. And again, it's an incredible place to have in New York.
And you don't have to be in New York. You know, you can send them in film, start a relationship with those guys. They will take care of you. I promise. That's who they are. They are really committed to doing a great job for everyone, whoever you are, whether you're a big shot or a small shot. So, so check them out.
Absolutely.
All right, let's do this. Peanut, if you're staying in the room, no talking. Hello, and welcome to the PhotoWork podcast, the talky and touchy-feely version of my book. It just seems so silly saying that at this point. I've got to say, Michael doesn't know that I was about to throw a wrench into the works from the very beginning there, but...
I'm holding on tight.
I don't know. Let me just see if there's something else here. Hello, and welcome to the PhotoWork podcast, the talky and touchy-feely podcast about photography.
All right.
I'm Sasha Wolf.
This is what meetings are for.
Listen, you're not feeling well. I didn't want to burden you.
Oh, thanks.
I think the audience appreciates being in on the
planning stages.
Planning? Who's planning? On the non-planning. Yeah, I'm recording from Woodstock, New York on a rainy, soggy fall day, but I love it. And I'm joined as usual by the man you just heard, my fellow traveler. A little under the weather is he. Mr. Michael feels like shit. Chauvin Dalton. Hello,
yes,
Michael.
Hello. Oh, hi. Yeah. Getting better, but I actually tested positive for COVID for the first time. Yeah.
I thought it was your second time, no?
Well, I was sick in March 2020 after coming back from Houston, and they didn't have tests. I'm pretty sure that's what it was, but that's why I said I tested positive for the first time. Yes.
Okay, yeah. You are a very precise individual, unlike me. I think the audience, by the way, has already figured that out. Oh boy. Let me just say that, I say I haven't had COVID yet. I've never tested positive for COVID. I've never thought I had COVID. And I have a few friends, though. If I say that around them, they're so offended. And I get it's like different degrees of snark. I either get the sort of quiet, gentle shiv of not that you know of. Okay, that's one.
Right.
One response. Right. And then the snarkier one that I get with regularity is, Oh, yeah, because you have the world's best immune system. And I'm like, look, all I said was, I mean, anyway, no winning there. But I'm really sorry that you're so under the weather. And
oh, thanks. I'm actually hitting day 6 tomorrow, which is the end of isolation. I did a critique today where I was on Zoom and all the students were in the classroom. It was quite hysterical. I was being wheeled around on a light stand.
Oh my God, that is fantastic.
Yes.
Were they drinking and smoking while
That's
you were?
Right.
So hi. We had a great trip to Atlanta. It was
so
wonderful to be with you in another state.
You too. Yeah, it was really a lot of fun. I mean, educational, fun, productive, everything you can ask for. Yes.
Yep. So we recorded 3 episodes while we were down there. The one today, which is with the curator of photography at the High Museum of Art, Gregory Harris. And he was in conversation with me but mostly with Rahim Fortune, who is involved, and we'll talk about it during the episode, so I'm not going to get into it now, but is involved with this exhibition. That was the occasion of why we went down, this incredible exhibition that we'll also talk about on the episode that just opened at the High. And then while we were there, we took advantage of being in Atlanta to bring in Irina Rozovsky, who's very close to Atlanta in Athens, Georgia, where she lives with her husband, Mark Steinmetz, and their daughter, and runs a great organization called The Human and is a great photographer. So we talked to Irina, and then we had a great conversation with the premier, or just to be, I guess, fair, I'll say, and non-biased, one of the premier photo dealers, gallerists.
Yes.
In the South, if not in the country. I mean, really an incredible Anna Walker-Skillman, who runs Jackson Fine Art. And so we have a great episode with her for the perspective, talking about photography from a gallerist's perspective. So a really good trip.
It was so exciting. Meeting all. I mean, I know Irina, and I've met Rahim, but just seeing everyone in person, it was just such a thrill. Thank you for bringing me along.
Yeah, of course. I think we wanted to eat more good Southern food, but we were both exhausted at the end of every day we were there, so we both collapsed. Anyway, well, this is a really wonderful episode, so a little on the long side. So I think let's just get to it. Why don't we? And it gets in a way that I think the audience will be able to. It doesn't need any context from us, right? I think we can just get to it.
I mean, I think all we need to say is to, if you can, get down to the High to see this fantastic show, A Long Arc Photography in the American South since 1845, which is what we'll also talk about in this episode, because I think it's going to be one for the books. I think it's going to be a show we'll be talking about for a long time. Yeah.
Yep, I agree. And the show is going to travel, but Atlanta's a really fun city that I know from prior trips has great food, even though I was mostly in my hotel room at night recuperating.
All right, so
this one.
Virginia Museum of Fine Art, we'll have to go down there and eat. And then also at the
Addison in Andover at Phillips Academy. So northeast of Virginia, it's at the High now into January. So worth seeing. Okay, Michael, if you don't mind, please get better and take it away.
Thank you. My pleasure. And here is your conversation with Greg Harris and Rahim Fortune.
Gregory Harris, Rahim Fortune, welcome to the PhotoWork podcast. For our listeners, we're actually all together, which is wonderful, including Mr. Michael Chauvin Dalton.
Hello.
Where's Peanut this time?
Oh, God, don't bring up Peanut. I have mother's guilt. So we are in a room at the wonderful High Museum in Atlanta. I was originally coming down to see, I told Michael I was coming down to see this exhibition, A Long Arc Photography in the American South since 1945, that my guest Greg Harris and his co-curator Sarah Kennel curated because a number of my artists are in the exhibition. I would have come down to see it anyway because it's right in my happy wheelhouse. Rahim wound up contributing an essay to the incredible book that Aperture made of the show. Anyway, we realized that this would be a really great opportunity to talk with Greg and Rahim together. Last night, they did a talk at the High Museum that was just absolutely wonderful. So happy to be here for that. And we'll be doing some other podcasts, taking advantage of the fact that we're in Atlanta. But let's get started now. So, Greg and Rahim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sasha.
Yes. Thank you, Sasha. It's great to see you both. Michael, great to see you.
So we'll start with short bios because I think there's a lot. First of all, you've both been on the podcast before, but there's a lot to get into. So, Greg, why don't you start and just tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm the photography curator here at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. I've been working in museums for close to 20 years. I started out when I was in college working at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, which is a fantastic place that employs a lot of students and gives people a lot of hands-on opportunities. And I kind of caught the curatorial bug when I was there. And then I moved up the street to the Art Institute of Chicago and was working in the photography department there for a number of years in various roles, from being a curatorial assistant, and I was an installer, and just kind of got to see how the inner workings of a museum really function. And then I spent 6 years at a small art museum at DePaul University, also in Chicago. It wasn't a photography-specific museum, but I tended to focus on photography projects, often around contemporary practice and interests of documentary, different notions of documentary, and that's kind of a thread that has persisted through my work. I've been at the High now since 2016 and have really kind of shifted my focus to photography of the South. It's not the only thing that we do, but it's one of the most important parts of the collection. And it's also something that's pretty distinctive for the High. There's not too many other museums that focus on all of the amazing work that's being made in the South. So even though I'm a born New Englander and grew up mostly in Chicago as an adult, I have somehow become an expert and a champion of Southern photography.
Thank you. Rahim?
Yes, it's great to be back on the podcast. Huge fan. So yeah, I grew up in Texas, and part of my youth I also grew up in Oklahoma, where my family has very long ties to the land there. My intro to photography was mostly through growing up interested in music and skateboarding. Both were cultures that cameras were heavily involved in, documenting different shows or different tricks that were happening. So there was a kind of natural inclination to either be on camera or to operate a camera. And, as I became older, I ended up connecting with a photographer named Eli Reed, who would come into the photo lab where I worked. And he was printing a grant application, and I just was like the eager, person, and just like really took it upon myself to like help him through the whole process and make him feel like he was working at like a top quality lab, even though it was like the local spot in Texas. And he really showed me a lot about what you could do with the black and white image. And I remember he said this funny thing because he was making some color work, and he was like, if they don't think the color work is strong, like I'm going to go tell them to look back at that black and white work and like, no, it's the same person. And I didn't know much about photography at the time. And just hearing him say that, it's Eli Reed, he's such a titan in photography. And that was actually a massive inspiration for me. Ended up moving to New York and studying sociology there at CUNY in Lower Manhattan, and working in New York and kind of getting this experience of not really like a transplant in New York, but like getting deep into like where native New Yorkers were. So going to the community college and working at this bakery in Gowanus, it really opened my mind to a lot, coming from Texas and coming from Oklahoma. When I went to New York in 2016, that was the first time I had gotten on a plane. So, I hadn't traveled too much in that sense, and it was just really a huge eye-opening experience. So I would stay in New York, continue to like be interested in photography, start making my own photographs. And yeah, to kind of jump ahead a little bit, I would work as a assistant and intern for many years while making my own work in Texas. As the years have gone by, I've been able to shift to being a full-time artist and, working with collaborators. And yeah, it's been a really great journey, meeting Sasha, meeting Greg, learning from everybody is, it's been a really cool experience.
So let's get into, thank you both. Let's get into this exhibition because there's a lot to talk about. And I want to start with the sort of just nuts and bolts mechanics of putting together a show of this size. So Greg, if you could tell us how big the show is, how it's structured, because I think that's, really integral to the show. And of course, having to give it some structure is key to the viewer's experience of it. So it's not just sort of, images flowing past, but the structure is really a big part of it. How you work with another curator, how you acquire the work that's in the show, that's sort of behind the scenes stuff that a lot of our listeners won't know.
Sure. So there are 181 photographs in the exhibition, and it takes up about 6,500 square feet of gallery space. So it's a pretty big show. It's structured more or less chronologically. So it begins in the 1840s. I think the earliest picture is kind of dated around 1845. And it goes up until just the last few years, 2019, 2020, I think is some of the most recent pictures in the exhibition. We structured the show around roughly 25, 30, 40-year chunks of time, and often kind of marked by significant events or shifts in the history of the country. The show is really a history of the South in photographs rather than a history of photography in the South. Some of it is kind of political events, kind of social rifts, but then also kind of artistic shifts that have happened, as you move later on in that chronology when there really is a fine art photography that's very clearly coming to fruition. And within those kind of chapters, such as it is, there are kind of themes that are kind of dominant or that we focused on. We try to really pull out.
Can you give a couple of examples?
So in the first section it focuses on the antebellum period and the Civil War. And so it's a lot about how photography is used in these very early days as a way of articulating identity in pictures, often around race and like how we understand race and how people project their identity and their status in photographs. And then alongside that, how pictures are used as a way of processing trauma and mourning, kind of particularly around, the great losses and traumas that happened during the Civil War. So this idea of like identity formation and kind of mourning and loss and kind of reconciliation through pictures are kind of like the big theme of that first chapter. The final chapter is about renegotiating what it means to be Southern and kind of what is the South, what is Southern identity, and kind of asking questions about who gets to tell those stories and who gets to make those statements. So a lot of it is kind of thinking about throughout the show, like we're always kind of asking like, well, what is the South? And we don't necessarily have a lot of hard and fast answers. It's something that we're trying to figure out in the process of putting together and putting on the exhibition. In terms of working with another curator, so we've been working on this show in one form or another for about 5 years, and it's evolved in a lot of different ways. And my co-curator, Sarah Kennel, used to be the head of the photography department here at the High, so we were working on it collaboratively here at the museum. And then when she left the High to go to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, she was still invested in the project and wanted to continue working on it. So we continued to collaborate, and the show will be traveling to Richmond in about a year as well. A lot of the exhibition is drawn from the High's permanent collection. We have around 9,000 photographs, and I would say about a third of those photographs are either by Southern makers or are of Southern subject matter. So that's really the base that we're drawing from. And so we're trying to kind of pull out what are the kind of key images, the key movements, the key photographers to try to build out this story. And sometimes we want to, hit the really well-known pictures of the really well-known makers, because this, it is a known history and we're not completely rewriting everything. So we're kind of building on something that's familiar for people. But then we also wanted to show some things that maybe would be unexpected or a little bit less well-known, or go deeper on particular areas where we can, and really try to sort of flesh out that narrative. And there's peculiarities to it because, our collection, as large as it is not exhaustive. So there's things that we don't have. Sometimes we were able to borrow it from other museums. Other times we just decided we can't show everything. We're kind of showing our version of this story. Another museum might tell an entirely different story of photography in the South. So this is very much like our take on that narrative.
I mean, one example of a period that everyone's going to sort of know that's going to be very familiar would be like the Great Depression. And it's probably was circling around in your head just now when you were mentioning that, right? Like the Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange.
mean, it's a watershed moment in the history of photography generally, and so many of the most iconic pictures from that period were made in the South. Like Walker Evans' pictures that he did for Let Us Now Praise Famous Men were made in Hale County, Alabama, and that's some of the work that he's most well known for. And I think as a lot of people are getting into photography, that's often some of the work that they're seeing for the first time when they're kind of wrapping their head around like what is photography? What can I do as a photographer who's kind of going out in the world and kind of responding to the things that you see? And so that was a hugely important moment in the history of photography, and we wanted to make sure that was focused on, because it's this moment where kind of photography really develops this language of documentary and kind of how to respond to the world, how to record the world, how to make pictures that look believable, authoritative, that seem to have kind of an objective look to them, but also where people are realizing photography can be used as a way to influence people and change people's minds. In this case, ideally for good ends. To kind of uplift people from rural poverty and really build an infrastructure to improve people's lives. So there was a form of propaganda of sorts, but it was also a way of telling stories and influencing legislature and public opinion.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great point, you saying that this is your interpretation on photography in the South, because there are endless readings. And I guess, from my end, looking at the show and getting a tour from you, you spoke to not being able to get every piece, but there was still something about the show that felt very comprehensive. So it didn't feel like this highly curated thing that was, just kind of abstractly within your own taste, but it still maintained that feeling that it does cover a lot of the images that are very well known and highly regarded and written about. Thinking about some of the writing of Deborah Willis and her writing about the daguerreotypes and learning about these alternate processes that photographers are doing at the kind of beginning of the medium. It's such a great launching pad for the show. Also, throughout the show, I think that there is, in a way, kind of a re-engagement with the archive and thinking about the way that the functions of even the FSA images might have changed, and how do we grapple with this kind of authoritative voice in the modern moment and kind of standards of aesthetic. And I just was really moved by that. And that's just the first two walls. I could go through a range of complex, provocative emotion from each section. Last night in the talk, I spoke about the impact that the post-war photographs had in the kind of clear changing of aesthetic and this kind of going from this like silent film, if you would, to something that feels more produced in a subtle, very subtle way. And these kind of practitioners who are a bit outside of canon, and like someone like Consuelo Kanaga, if I'm saying the name correctly, I've always been super interested in her work and very fascinated in how this work that is overtly documentary, because it is documenting a time and a place and a people who otherwise, left few documents behind, but also the aesthetic choices are just things that have always been really influential to me as an artist. And yeah, as you start to get into the 80s, that work is incredible. Early Hudnall, obviously, Baldwin Lee. So, these are people who have been known, people who are also having new moments. Baldwin's work is just being more widely circulated, but kind of highly regarded, and after being known in smaller forms for a while. So like I said, I think that this show is really important because in a way it's a major re-engagement, and it's like a reshuffling of the deck of how we think about Southern photography. And I think that's a great kind of launching point with the book, and the fact that people who you have writing for the book are people who are, we've been friends for a while, and I know some of the writers in the books, like people who are all thinking about similar things. And after conversations that we've had, I think it's just great to see it kind of materialize in something that is also influential for people who are interested in getting into photography and maybe don't know as much. It feels like something a little bit more approachable than maybe it's been in the past.
I'm happy to hear you say that, because one of the things that we were keeping in the back of our minds as we were putting the show together was, can you tell the story of photography in the United States and only use pictures that were made in the South to do it? And I think maybe in some ways you can, in other ways you can't. But, the South is so critical to the overall history of photography in America, and yet it's rarely focused on in that kind of specific way. And so we wanted to try to put the South back at the center of the story of American photography. And there's certain things like the Institute of Design was in Chicago, not in the South. And that was, a hugely important institution that influenced so many things that happened in photography. So there's certain aspects that we can't really touch on with that. But in a lot of ways, you can tell a pretty comprehensive history of American photography just by looking at what happened in the South and the work that's been made in the South.
I want to take us, and we'll get back to sort of where we are now, but I don't want to lose this thread that sort of popped up a little bit earlier, because I'm really curious about your thoughts about this. In the exhibition, which obviously in this way will not translate to the book, but in the exhibition, the object is extremely important. How did you think about that? Because I know for me, walking through yesterday, and we were all together, so I could see Michael and Rahim also becoming really taken with the different printing styles, the very early printing styles, and the way in which the photograph was revered as object. You saw that often in the way they were presented in sort of elaborate ways. The frame or the container, the vessel was extremely important. How do you think about that when translating to a book, or how do you just think about it in the exhibition?
It's an interesting process to work through, because a lot of the time when we're putting together the exhibition, we're looking at thumbnails or printouts, things like that. Like we often will go and like look at the piece in storage, but sometimes they're really big, or they're in a box that's, in the back behind something else. And like not everything is readily accessible. We don't have all, 180 pictures around us. So we're looking at we're working mainly with a reproduction of something. And then when we get into the layout phase, we're starting to think about the three-dimensional experience that someone's going to have moving through the space. And we're also working on the book at the same time. And with the book, we can change the size of an object. We can run it across the gutter. We can make it a half page. So they're really images that you're working with. And that's a particular way of telling a story. And it's very, kind of very linear as you kind of move through the book. There's certain kinds of adjacencies that you can do. But when you're putting together an exhibition, it's something that you experience, in time and in space. And the objects have dimensions. They have, physical characteristics, which have meaning on their own, and they also change the experience that you have as a viewer. I mean, think about, looking at a daguerreotype in a book. It's ink on paper, but when you actually see a daguerreotype, it's a mirrored surface. If you move around it, the image kind of disappears. You move again, it pops back up. You can see your own reflection in the image. They're small. They are meant to be held in your hand. I mean, we're not letting people hold the daguerreotypes when they come to see the show, but
we tried, but he said no.
But you can get that. You can get that sense that this was something that you had a physical engagement with, not just, you weren't just looking at it, you were holding it in your hand and kind of communing with that image. And then as you move further into the exhibition, and as you get more into the contemporary end of the show, the scale shifts.
That's
like
right.
The pictures become really big, and like that's an intentional choice. Like you're having, an encounter. It's also a physical encounter. Like you're standing in the presence of that image. There's a very large portrait by Zora Murph that's like 6 feet tall, and so it's a portrait of his father, and he's almost life size in that image, and you're kind of confronted with that presence, and so that really changes the experience that you have of the image. Like in the book, everything is kind of equalized, and in the show, there's a lot of shifts in scale that change the way that you experience the photograph, and that's really important. But it's kind of one of the last things that we think about as we're putting together the exhibition.
Well, I would just say, as someone who just was a viewer yesterday, that everyone should come down and see the exhibition. The book is amazing, but the experience, I mean, we were oohing and eyeing.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I was like, I look at pictures a lot of the time of, most days, but that is a different experience.
It is.
It's a bodily thing. Looking at all of those images, it's a whole, it's like you were saying, speaking to the print quality, because I think that's so much of what I say, like when, for lack of better words, this kind of tangible nature, and that you are engaging with in a very sensory level.
Absolutely.
So, I'm kind of fumbling through the language to describe it, but that's something that I was really struck by. As I said, someone who is familiar with a lot of these works, seeing them as the print was just incredible, especially a lot of the early vintage works. And I'm like, I got to take one more walk through and look at some of those like presentations and choices, because I do think about size and the intimacy of the viewing experience. And I'm really interested in, going back through and looking at it more from that stance.
And also, I mean, when you're in that first room and you're faced with the Civil War, and you're faced with, you're looking at pictures of former slaves, and you're looking at pictures of black soldiers on the battlefield. And obviously the content is so incredibly moving, but you add to that all the different processes. We were looking at albumin prints and tintypes. There was one cyanotype in there, a lot of daguerreotypes. And you have a sense of the people who were holding that work, the people who owned that work, where it lived in somebody's home, how it might have been an important part of a family's mantelpiece and their history. And knowing that the container, the frame, the worn parts were someone in the 1800s was holding it and probably proud of their son or their husband or whatever. There were beautiful pictures of black men dressed beautifully, having their portrait taken, like just knowing, that's something for me that was extremely visceral. And the quality of those different print processes contributed to the whole experience. So I'm really making a pitch for people to come and experience this in person.
Yes, I mean, there's something really interesting about the point you're making, Sasha. While staying here in Atlanta, you just watch cable TV in your hotel room, and Spike Lee's Malcolm X was on, and I'm watching Denzel perform as Malcolm X, and the film is shot in color, and then they kind of have these sequences at the end that show Malcolm in black and white, and you're like, he was there in color, and I think about that within these images, like the people who appeared in these images appeared in their time and in their presence, and in a subtle way, it kind of says something about a very pulled away perspective of just mortality of this current moment is actually all we have, and everyone's kind of doing their own jobs to document that. And I think there's also an interesting kind of duality with what you said about these images that are more vernacular photographs and are more kind of totems to people's self-making and self-image. And I've always been extremely interested in the Black American relationship to photography and upward mobility and, the creating of self that happens since literally the beginning of the medium. And post-emancipation, the photographs that you begin to see from the first Black practitioners are all incredible. And then you get into what then is deemed as art photography. And there's this kind of separation, that happens there. And now these gaps are being bridged and we're engaging with it differently. But I just really do love to stay a little bit just critical in how we view these images. They are beautiful photographs, but they also are highly sensationalized. Some of them are made in some questionable nature. So I think that two things can be true at once. These things are, but so I do think that one thing to keep in mind while, enjoying that, and something I'm always kind of trying to remind myself within documentary as a practice is to the investment within the people as people and not just photographs. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, incredible show. Yeah. Hats off.
Thank you.
Rahim, one thing that I noticed yesterday when we were walking through, and you just mentioned Consuelo Kananga, but your eyes lit up when we got to a photograph that she made on the wall, and also Marion Palfy. They're next to each other in the exhibition. And you said, now, this is really me now here. Can you talk about that? We'll have those pictures on the episode page on the website so people can see what I'm talking about.
Yes. I am always kind of referencing different images, both especially kind of working in the fashion context. A lot of the making work is built in this kind of language of image and kind of catalogs of images. And also within forming my voice within my personal work as well. There's always this kind of looking at different things. And I always talk to students about this kind of the artists that you choose to emulate in some way are your voice. You surpass your influences. That's something a lot of teachers talk about. It's you find your influences and then you kind of step away from them. And so that was kind of those two images, particularly aesthetically, really stood for things that I'm very interested in. The image on the left shows a woman, she's seated. There's a very hard flash, but the way that it is printed, the highlights are very muted and the shadows fall very dark, which is sometimes a difficult visual technique to capture well. You can lose a lot of information in the background. The image becomes, so it functioned in this very interesting way. And I have a few photographs that just made it through enough, and you kind of find that magic with the flash technique or a printing technique where the image is just right there on the cusp. And I was really interested in that because I'm also so interested in the dynamic of when the person made the photograph. How many exposures did you take? How many times did you flash at this person? Like, what does the other negatives look like? So there's all these small decisions that go into like the image that finally arrives on the wall.
Did everyone hear what he just said? So many small decisions that go into the image that winds up on the wall. I mean, that's why I wanted you to talk about this, because, a lot of people really just don't understand, especially in the style of work where things aren't heavily staged or directed necessarily, seemingly directed, that for a photographer like you, there's still, what makes you an excellent artist, in my opinion, among a number of things, but I want to just underline the rigor with which the ultimate image is decided upon. A million decisions are made. People who are sort of less fluent in this and need to learn if they want to get to a point where you're at, is that don't just keep moving quickly and think there isn't a decision there somewhere to be made to make the image better. There's always a million decisions that can be made.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm pulling that like kind of idea and framing from Larry Sultan, I believe is who I heard say that in a lecture, that being an artist is making a million decisions in 1 second. It's where to stand, what camera, all the various decisions that are made either instinctually or as you kind of begin to really break down the fundamentals, as you were talking about earlier with the FSA, like this idea of kind of cracking the code a little bit with the image making and like learning these kind of visual cues that would just kind of objectively make an image work or not, or more or less the better way is function. Yeah, I think that's a huge point. And when reading work, to look at it in that way, sometimes I'll look at someone's work and I'm so fascinated because it's mysterious to me. And I think the best work in a way should be like a bit mysterious. Like you're so curious about how this came to be. And I start digging away and try to learn how did those things happen and looking into what articles people have done or what has been written about the work. And Consuelo Kanaga, her work, she really uses a lot of stark contrast of blacks and whites. I mean, which is a kind of a cliche for black and white photography, but she approaches it in a very intentional way with the framing and the clothing. Maybe it's just the clothing of the time was not like highly patterned, but that's something that has also always struck to me. And that again becomes one of those kind of like objective things of function. It's like, well, it's clean, more or less, like the images.
Or maybe let me just, excuse me, I just want to interject, go back to what you were saying earlier. Maybe she asked her sitter not to wear a pattern, right?
Yeah.
She took control of her photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, would be just one of the many things that I'm picking up from various artists that's like, okay, I'm noted, and, it kind of makes its way into your work. So throughout the show, there were so many moments where I was just humbled and taken aback and like just a fan, and the large print by Christine Potter, and being kind of, in a way, I always point out these little things with Greg and I always talk about this as an artist. Sometimes somebody tells you something about your work and you're like, yep, that was on purpose, but really it was, you're learning from the person's read from it. And I think that that's something you kind of learn about your work as it's in the real world. You can only know so much about it, as you said, when it's a thumbnail and you're kind of conceptualizing, but when you put it up, there's something about it being in real life that you kind of like, you learn from that. If you took out all the walls, Sally Mann's print and Christine's print were like kind of like on opposite sides of the space in a way. And it just felt like just to really like, that was just something I would probably pick up. And I just feel like those two works are so in step with each other. And it's just really beautiful to see that, kind of cross-generational conversation between artists, because we need someone like you to facilitate that.
Greg, can you talk a bit about the decision to end the show, not in 2020, that's neither here nor there, whether it was 2020, 2021, 2022, but on this clear concept idea of the new Southerner, because obviously that's really important and key. And was it obvious? How did you get to that? And maybe talk a bit about some of the images that are, give that feeling at the end of the show.
So the very honest answer is that we kind of reverse engineered that, because the show comes chronologically, and you're kind of following what photographers are doing and what they're telling you, and kind of trying to sort that out and kind of pull out what are the kind of the ideas that are connecting. everything. And so some of that just kind of happened by happenstance as we're kind of like arranging the pictures. But then when we're putting them up on the walls, you're trying to create conversations between pictures. And the show ends with two almost competing themes. There's one that talks about a lot of the tension and anxiety and anger that exists in contemporary America, and a lot of it is kind of centered in the South. Whether that's division around politics or identity, how we interpret history. So a lot of the pictures kind of deal with that tension. And on the other side, kind of facing those pictures, are images that are of all young people of varying races, ethnicities, gender identities that really are complicating our sense of, who is a Southerner, what is the South, what kind of makes up the culture of the South, who's writing the culture of the contemporary South, whether that's in pictures or words or films. And we kind of wanted those things to live alongside one another. So there's, Tommy Kah's self-portrait of him dressed up as Elvis, kind of reappropriating this image, of an iconic masculine Southerner in Elvis. And then there's also Jose Ibarra-Rizzo's picture of a young Mexican-American couple embracing out in nature. And it's like this beautiful bucolic image of kind of connection and affection. And across from that, there's a picture by Alex Harris that was made on a movie set, and it's of a white cop and a black cop shouting at each other. And it's a stage scene. It was, he was filming on a movie set, but it's such a charged image that I think speaks to a lot of the tension and anger that exists in the country right now. And the final picture is by Irina Rozovsky, and it's of a young girl sitting at the end of a road that goes into a river that has flooded. And it's kind of an ominous picture, but it I think also is a picture that seems to have a lot of possibility. So we don't know where things are going. It's meant to kind of be open-ended. The river could recede. The river could keep rising. There's all kinds of ways that story could go. And I think we wanted the show to feel kind of open-ended. This is, the show ends in 2023 because that's when we put it up. But the story of photography in the South is going to keep going. And, someone's going to do another version of this show in 5, 10, 25 years, we hope, and tell another version of that story. And this will just be, kind of a moment in time. But we wanted to talk about how the South is changing in really dramatic ways. And, earlier in the show, we can kind of look back and we have all of this perspective and all of this time to kind of see how these things played out. And we don't know how a lot of these things are playing out right now, but it feels like we're living in this moment where everything is up for grabs. And, the culture, the country could go in any number of directions. But you feel this sense that there's something in the air, that something is happening, and we're kind of at a pivot point in a lot of ways.
Did you learn anything? I mean, I'm sure you learned a lot, but in doing this show, was there a particular section, time period that you were less familiar with that was a real learning experience for you, which I assume would have been also a really wonderful experience? I know you like to learn like the rest of us.
Probably the earliest part of the exhibition. So my work as a curator tends to focus on contemporary photography. I love working with artists and helping them craft their exhibitions and kind of take the pictures that they've made and kind of figure out how to put them out in the world. I'm, less steeped in the early history of photography, and I'm kind of conversant in it, but it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise. And I think one of the things that Sarah taught me was, all of the real, intentionality that went into a lot of these pictures, and being able to kind of step back and see what were photographers and sitters doing at this time. Because in a lot of cases, the sitter hired the photographer to make an image, and so it was a really collaborative process about how that portrait was going to be made. And to be able to look at those pictures and kind of see how kind of the politics, the social agendas of the time even come through in these, seemingly very humble portraits. It's from the very first pictures, you can see that, the racial hierarchies are inscribed into these pictures. There's pictures of, a black enslaved nanny holding a white child, and the child, ostensibly, owns, or their family owns the person that is holding them in that picture. And there's a lot of power, there's a lot of heartbreak, there's a lot of, anger that I think that can kind of stir up in you. And then right around the corner, we have a picture of two freed black men that was made in the 1850s. And for them to be able to walk into a studio, and kind of declare the fact that they exist, that they are important, they are people of consequence, and that they were able to use photography to make that declaration. I mean, I think you look at a picture, it's like, oh, that's a nice portrait. Those guys are dressed up really well. But just think about like what was going on at that time. The country didn't even acknowledge that they were citizens, that they were people. But to be able to say, I am a person and I matter, and be able to document that in an image, there's so much power in that. And I think sometimes when I look at pictures like that, I kind of take it for granted. It's like, oh, that's a historic moment. Isn't that kind of quaint? Look at those hairstyles and the funny patterns on their pants or something like that. But to really think like what they were doing with that picture, kind of what is like the subtle but very powerful gesture that comes through in that image.
One of the things that was the most surprising to me, and just going with what you're saying, was the 6 images, I think, by the Massengill family of this young woman that feels very before its time, where she seems to be. Oh, I'll let you describe it.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite suites of images in the show, suites of photographs in the show. So they're all of this young woman, Evelyn Massengill, who married into a family of itinerant photographers that traveled around rural Arkansas in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And they built these portable studios that were kind of, reconfigured photo booths, essentially. So rather than being like an automatic photo booth, there was actually, an operator. They would pose people. They would, click a shutter. They would take the picture. And then it would, spit out a strip of pictures, and you get 3 of them for a dime. But between paying clients, Evelyn would, take pictures of herself or have family members take pictures of her. And I think there's at least 30 of these known portraits. We have 6 of them in the collection, but you can see her trying on all of these different facets of her identity. I think she's about 17 when she started making these pictures.
Which, of course, is a very contemporary concept.
She's becoming a woman, and she's kind of figuring out what is her place in the world, what is her role on her own as herself, what is her role, what is her identity in relation to other people. So you see her, in one of them she's got this hat on that she's got tilted at this very jaunty angle, and she seems like really cosmopolitan. There's another where she's got a double exposure of herself, kind of taking on like maybe 2 sides of her personality. But then you also see her posing with her husband, or posing with her with her child. And, she's a mother, she's a wife, she's a partner. And, there's another where she's wearing kind of like a nightgown. And so there's this kind of emerging sense of her own sexuality in the picture too. And you just, it's fascinating to see how she's like using photographs to try on these different aspects of her, of
that
herself.
Was really made a strong impression with me as well. These pictures are from the late 30s, and, to see someone doing this type of self-portraiture, and where some she looks like she's 12 and some she looks like, a fully grown.
Yeah, remind me what year those were produced.
Between 1937 and 1941.
Nice. So that's pre-World War II.
Yeah, right at the beginning of World War II. So the tail end of the Depression.
It's very fascinating, because also thinking about the relationship to World War II and the mailing of portraits is something that's really interesting in the creation of self-portraits. A series of portraits in my family archive of my great-grandmother that were sent to her husband while he was overseas, and they were taken by my grandmother. And there's one where she's sitting on a Cadillac. There's one where she's doing her makeup in the mirror, and it's that shines a light on something that I think is very interesting. And thinking about how we view these images, again, thinking about the relationship between the people who are in them and the people who are making them. And, going back to what you're saying about the Civil War, I think that it's so interesting thinking about the earliest people kind of cracking the code. I guess even like from the chemistry level of how intense it was to make photographs at that time. And there was, pretty much I'm saying there was black folks on both sides of the camera. I'm just trying to get that out there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the earliest pictures in the show is a daguerreotype that was made by J.P. Ball, who was a black photographer working in Virginia.
Yeah, no, it was so incredible to get to walk through with you guys and, spend some time here in Atlanta. It's been a real treat. And I highly suggest, if you're in the area or you can make it out here, come and see the show. It will be traveling as well. So there will be hopefully a lot of chances for folks to get out here and experience this.
And if you can't, of course, get the book. So you contributed, Rahim, an essay to the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about the piece you wrote? And you wrote it with a friend of yours, a collaborator.
Yes. It's funny. Can I tell the story of how it came to be?
Of course. I'm
at Perry Photo last year, and I get a text from Greg. He's like, "Hey, man, would you like to meet for breakfast? I want to ask you something." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Let's do it." So Miranda, my girlfriend, and I, we meet Aaron and Gregory at a crepe spot, and he seemed a little nervous. I was like, "What's going on? Is everything okay?" And he asked me, he's like, "We're doing a book, and I was just curious if you would want to do an essay. I know it might be like a, quite the ask, but we would love to have you write. And, I kind of reluctantly say, yeah, I would.
I think I also told you that we needed it in like 6 weeks. So.
I think there was a bit of a time crunch there, but, I come into the work that I do first as a photographer, and as I begin to engage deeply with the history and these kind of conceptual ideas around photography, I've gotten more interested in writing. I've always been a little bit more interested in writing, even back to my grade school time, kind of thinking about these large stories, and just also enjoying the idea of just putting words on paper is something that can be therapeutic. But when you sit down to write, I always say that it feels sometimes like you're kind of confronted with your own intellect, and you have to really kind of stand on these ideas that otherwise you can kind of, in conversation is much different than putting it on a piece of paper.
Absolutely.
And so that is its own relationship. And so it can be pretty daunting. I worked with an incredible editor and co-writer, Shakira Smith. She received her PhD at Harvard, and we met while working on a project in Louisiana, photographing a small community called Hillaryville that's off the Mississippi River. And so we were working on this project there, and she was kind of our point of reference, but also like provided like such a critical resource. She was a good friend of the artist who we were working with. He had seen the work of myself and my collaborator, Ade Randall, and he wanted us to come do a small film and a series of photographs in his town. And so while we were there, she kind of provided this really incredible resource. And I guess like as a photographer, those people are actually really important, even just the person who drives. So you can get out or look out the window. And I think that that's something that of collaboration within photography that's really important. Shows us not just one person like in a vacuum making it. At times, maybe someone is the solo, but a lot of times there's these multiple people who are investing other facets of their work to result in the image.
Definitely. So
our conversations around photography and these kind of studies of like restorative histories and visual medicine as being things that actually could be healing, to traumas was like, we were right on time, with the way that we were thinking about art in the South. And so when I began writing the essay, I asked her if she would come on to help me edit, kind of help me to be able to just get out what it is that I'm interested in saying, and her to kind of help me get it into more of an academic and literary language. So it was a strong collaboration for weeks because she's not coming from a photography background. And so all of the ideas are coming from me, and she's helping me with these forms and really being a great addition. And so we work together in various facets as far as grant writing and copy editing. And so to artists, just know you don't have to do it all yourself. Find collaborators, invest in other people who,
great point.
Because you kind of, people will show up for you as much as you show up for them. And I think that that's important for like building out your community and resources. So yes, we started working on the essay, and I was really interested in this idea of the history of photography. Well, this is what Gregory was, we spoke about, was kind of my view of history of photography in the South, which is the overarching theme of the book. And so I started out thinking about this kind of moment in the late 70s where I kind of described it as this post-Civil War, post-Vietnam America, where there's kind of this huge call to action, and this next generation kind of does not have the same kind of tangible things to go photograph in this social realm. And that's not true necessarily, because there was a lot of photography also happening of the farm working, that was going on in South Texas. There was a lot of things happening in the Valley and this kind of rallying, but pretty much it's like you're thinking about these timelines, and you have like someone like a Russell Lee who was affiliated with the FSA, and him starting this program in UT in the kind of coming of the MFA photography program. That was not a thing of the previous generation. And then you have someone like a Danny Lyons, who was heavily involved with the politics in Texas as well as civil rights. And so this following generation, you start to see this kind of settling in of art aesthetics and art as practice and primary function. And I feel as though a lot of photographers kind of use the South as a launching pad for finding visual language. I mean, the list goes on. You could think of someone like an Alex Webb or Eugene Richards and a host of other artists who go to the South and kind of use that same tradition and lineage of social engagement to look at the tenement farming and the sharecropping that's going on in the South. And so there's this dual thing that's happening there, because I do think that sometimes it's like the good faith coastal person who's like, and I think that formation and idea is something to be critical of in the way that there's so much virtue, I guess, within photography, in the history of photography, as you've spoken. It's this kind of urge to help, and how there is like these kind of biases in how the viewpoint and who the people who are in in need of help, and how that again goes back into the making of self-image and the image that is viewed by others. So I could go on and on. It's a very, very heavy concept that you kind of start to get into at that intersection of this kind of urge to help in those people who need help and versus self-sustainability. So I was going through these decades. I was really pouring through it. With my essay, I took out all references because I was not sending any shots at anybody, because that's not a pointed critique, because people made such incredible work, but it's just a re-engagement in a kind of thinking. So it's not to be combative with those people who made that work or to overtly kind of want to tear the whole infrastructure of it down, but it was just my own perspective on the history of photography in the South, as kind of learning as a Southerner, as a Black American, as someone who is, grew up in Oklahoma and, a tribal community, and these relationships to photography might not be the same for, myself and other kind of marginalized folks than it would be for someone who just like has the extensive family archive or has a different relationship to this kind of rallying in America. So yes, get back to the essay. I apologize. I really, it's a very complex kind of series of ideas we got into. And then we also kind of touched on these ideas of people who were coming from the outside. I think that post-World War II was so massive for that for various reasons, because you had Northern Black folks going to the South for forts that could operate throughout the year. This is also at the time of integration of the military, which just completely changed the country, as well as the early 1920s and the teens as the Red Summer. There's these fever pitch moments. And I often just think about the tumultuous times we're in now and how we think like, wow, those end times. I'm like, well, let's open up a history book and look at some of the crazy stuff that's happened in the past. It's in a way kind of unfathomable how each of these generations had this really particular set of circumstances that they're working against. And this is just something that, we were speaking about the other day, kind of thinking about the decades. It's like, the 40s is associated with the World War II. The 70s is associated with Vietnam. There's kind of the Civil War. There's kind of these constant conflicts. And I think in the current moment, that's something that people may continue to reflect on and will also become more present in the work that's being produced now. Again, back to the essay. We started thinking about this. Why I bring up World War II is because as Black soldiers start to go overseas, this engagement with Black Americans in Europe is changing, and this starts to really change the way that America in the segregated society is viewed. And so America is trying to be this kind of, forerunner in democracy and freedom and equality, and you still have people who are being treated as second-class citizens who are contributing so much to the country. So we could do a whole separate podcast about just looking at the way that World War II changed racial dynamics in America and ultimately led to integration. And so a lot of European photographers would come over and kind of pointedly want to show that America thinks that they're this place of freedom, but let me kind of show what is actually happening here.
Hypocrisy.
Yes, and there's works like Jakob Holt is a big kind of a person that I often talk about, whose work, is very complex in its, relation and looking at the South. So again, it's just these various viewpoints that I'm extremely interested in. And in the end of the essay, we start to look at two artists, Early Hudnall and Ramel Ross. Early Hudnall is from Houston, Texas, and he's been working there for many decades. He's works at a university, and he's been photographing Fourth Ward for decades, and he's made these very striking black and white photographs of Fourth Ward that are in a major way in conversation with a kind of generation of photographers that's happening around the country. Traveling around the country, you find in these various towns, there was always, a kind of well-known practicing Black photographer engaging in this form of community photography. One who really struck me was Don Thompson, who was working in Tulsa, Oklahoma during the 80s. He was photographing Black Wall Street. I feel there's a lot of connections between him and Early Hudnall. Eli Reed is working at this time. And I kind of find these visual similarities. These people might not have even been looking at the same work, but it's also in a huge way in step with Kamunge workshops that's happening at the same time in New York City. And so there's kind of this, there was also the Black Photographers Annual that was published. It was kind of this annual publication. Then there was also various Black photography photo contests. So there's a culture of image making and this idea of black and white poetry, of reshaping the way that we're viewing. And this is also, I guess, an important context because because this is post-crack epidemic and post-integration. Like this idea of community photography is very different than what it was in this time where there was this more self-sustaining community and more connected fibers of pre-gentrified Black communities. So his work is a huge marker to that. The other artist is Ramel Ross, who is most known for a body of work created in Hell County, Alabama, where he produced a series of photographs in a film that was highly awarded and, really was kind of like a real like watershed moment for experimental documentary. And so I was really interested in how his photographs and his film function so differently. His film is mostly shot on kind of more lo-fi cameras. It seems as though the camera is just rolling, and he really is allowing the subject matter to just play out in front of him. He was also teaching in the town where he was living for a long time, so he had a really strong connection to the community and the youth of this place, which I think is also really beautiful to come in as a kind of, adult and to be able to invest in people. Just that energy is very helpful. And I find that even just in being a photographer, a journalist, there is a thing of just showing up for people and being there. And that comes through strong in his work. And his photographs are not what I would expect of seeing the video. It's extremely candid. It's extremely loose. He works primarily with color 8x10, which is a very pricey and very slow medium, but it also has these huge tiebacks to the region with the artist William Christenberry, who is known for his 8x10 color photographs. And so he really kind of pushes up against some of these ideas we have about documentary while also kind of agreeing to some of the terms that, that are set in the tripod, the big camera, this kind of collaboration. But, rather than engaging in kind of direct formal portraits, he makes these very nuanced images that often show people kind of askewed from the camera or abstracted. And I think, the way I was describing it in my conversation with Gregory last night is I feel as though those images are very bold in their attempt. They didn't rely on the roadmap too particularly. And I'm very interested in seeing the new languages of documentary. And I think that he was a really great example. So we tie the essay off by kind of looking at these two artists and how there is this new moment in photography where a lot of the value is kind of placed on the interconnectedness to the images and being more interested in the closeness in relation to the subject matter. And I think this is a theme that has gone on for a long time. And as we start to see more of like family work, someone like an Emmett Gowan or, John Gossage, who's making work just about your lived experience, not going outside of that realm to make work. I think that it's something I'm really excited about. And hopefully my work, speaks to those same qualities.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to wrap up. Thank you both so much for your time. Gregory Harris, Rahim Fortune, it's really been so wonderful to spend time with you both over the past couple of days and to do this together this morning. So thank you.
Thanks for having us, Sasha.
Thank you guys.
PhotoWork with Sasha Wolf is a production of the PhotoWork Foundation. Executive producer is Sasha Wolf, and the associate producer is Taylor Selsback. The show is also produced and edited by me, Michael Chauvin-Dalton of Real Photo Show. Music is by J. Walter Hawks. If you like the show and wish to find out more about the Foundation, please visit photowork.foundation and be sure to subscribe and review with all the stars on your listening platform.